Hello, I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Welcome to CHCI's 2023 Capitol Hill Briefing Series. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month postgraduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional Latinos from throughout the country unparalleled hands-on experience working in public policy here in Washington, D.C. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen their professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, this year specifically in the areas of health, technology, housing, education, and the environment. CHCI is thrilled to offer our postgraduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues they're passionate about and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. We'd like to thank our postgraduate fellowship program sponsors, whose support for the program is invaluable. The sponsors include Meta, the PepsiCo Foundation, America's Health Insurance Plans, the Walton Family Foundation, Bristol Myers Squibb, Microsoft, DaVita, Wells Fargo, and CVS Health. During and after today's session, you can keep this important conversation going and broaden the number of people engaged by using the hashtag CHCIFellows on social media. We hope that you will. To learn more about our postgraduate fellowship program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events, please visit chci.org. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows directly via LinkedIn to learn more about their policy topic, and also please help them connect with job opportunities for when their program concludes in May. Thanks so much for joining us. And now, enjoy the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Adam Schiff from California's 30th Congressional District. I would like to welcome you all today to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Policy Briefing Series, The Real Cost of Food, Examining Food Affordability and Environmental Sustainability, moderated by Evelyn Vivar. I am so proud of our wonderful CHCI-Meta graduate fellow, Evelyn, who for the last 7 months has worked on an array of issues related to water accessibility, green transportation, and environmental and food justice. Evelyn is a passionate advocate for building a sustainable food system that has the power to mitigate climate change, empower farmers and consumers, and feed communities nutritious and affordable food. She has provided invaluable insights to my legislative team, and we are so grateful to have her in our office, and I know you will all benefit from her insights today. Thank you, and good luck, Evelyn.
Thank you, Congressman Schiff, for that thoughtful introduction. It is an honor to be introduced by a leader as yourself who is committed to taking every bold action necessary to help the United States transition to an environmentally sustainable future that centers frontline communities. I would now like to welcome you all to the final CHCI's Capitol Hill Policy Briefing Series. As mentioned, my name is Evelyn Vivar, and I'm the CHCI-Meta Graduate Fellow. I am delighted and honored to be moderating today's discussion titled The Real Cost of Food, Examining Food Affordability and Environmental Sustainability, alongside our expert panelists who will provide their insights and experience on tackling our country's challenging food system. Before I get started, I would like to thank my parents, who inspired me to learn more about the linkages between agriculture, climate change, and food insecurity. As a daughter of 2 Ecuadorian immigrants, I grew up listening to my father's stories of him working on my grandfather's farm, harvesting sugarcane and cultivating the land through agroecological practices. Through food and storytelling, I connected with my culture across time and space, and it allowed me to develop my interest in food systems and food justice. This panel brings together my family's lived experiences and my professional interests. In today's panel, we will discuss the importance of creating an equitable food system, emphasizing the importance of sustainable agriculture practices as a viable pathway to strengthen resilience, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and increase food sovereignty. So, what is the current landscape of our food system? Today, our food and agriculture system is controlled by a handful of monopoly corporations that often use chemical fertilizers, pesticides, antibiotics, genetic technology, and mechanization to maximize food production. They have also been shown to have negative impacts on consumers, farm workers, and the environment. Agricultural activities such as deforestation, methane release from livestock, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer use contribute to 25% of global and 11% of US greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gas emissions further drive climate change, increase the number and severity of fire seasons, droughts, floods, and intense heat waves. Additionally, enough food is produced worldwide to feed everyone. However, the availability varies enormously. Changes in food prices fundamentally affect the quantity and quality of food available to an individual. According to the USDA, more than 34 million people in the United States are food insecure, and communities of color and rural communities are disproportionately impacted by changes in food prices. For example, 1 in 6 Latinos experience food insecurity, which is 2.5 times higher than white individuals. As climate change worsens, the debate on how to grow food intensifies. Sustainable agriculture has immense potential to sequester carbon, conserve biodiversity, improve local livelihoods, and amplify the voices of marginalized communities. However, the question remains, how can the US produce environmentally sustainable food while ensuring food affordability? Today, we seek to unpack this question. I'd also like to note that you can add questions in the chat box, and we'll dive into these questions in our Q&A session later in the discussion. I will now introduce our expert panelists. With us today is Sarah Cardin, Senior Policy Advocate at Farm Action. She joined Farm Action to raise awareness and advocate for policies that meaningfully reform the nation's food and agriculture system. She has been working on food system reform for over a decade and brings expertise on local food systems and distribution networks, agriculture, nonprofit development, and food entrepreneurship. Welcome, Sarah. We also have Amy Tamayo, National Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, where she advocates alongside farm worker women in advancing immigration, environmental justice, workers' rights, and ending violence against women. Amy is a daughter of immigrant parents from Mexico and is proud to be advocating for Campesinex communities. Thank you, Amy, for joining us. Our third panelist, Eloisa Trinidad, is Executive Director at Chili's on Wheels, where she works to make healthy food accessible to communities in need through direct food relief, policy, education, and mentorship. Through an anti-colonial lens, she works with various coalitions and organizations as an advisor to develop community-informed strategies and policies to transcend poverty, mitigate climate breakdown, and build a more just and sustainable world for all. Welcome, Eloisa. Finally, Vanessa Garcia Polanco is the Policy Campaign's co-director of the National Young Farmers Coalition. Vanessa works with food, agriculture, and climate stakeholders to create and strengthen communities with policy and advocacy. Her research has focused on racial equity in food systems governance, sustainable agriculture, and resilient food systems and communities. As an Afro-Dominican immigrant, she incorporates her experiences and identities into her research and advocacy. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining us. It is such an honor to be joined by passionate food system advocates, and I'm very excited to share this space with them. We're now going to begin our moderated part of the discussion. As a reminder, please feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A and engage with our panelists in the chat box. We will be recording your questions and getting through many of them during the Q&A session. So to get us started with the discussion, I want to dive deeper into the cost of our food system. Sarah, from your perspective, can you expand on the hidden costs and common misconceptions of our current food system? Do we really need industrial agriculture to keep food prices affordable?
Thanks. Yeah. So to answer this question, you really need to understand that in today's food and agriculture system, a handful of corporations are dictating who farms, what they farm, and who gets to eat. Following decades of unchecked consolidation, they have used their market power and their undue influence to externalize their costs and extract excessive profits out of consumers. They would have you believe that they are the only logical choice, that they are the most efficient, affordable, economic, climate-smart food production system available, but this is simply not true. The problem is that industrial agriculture has infiltrated and influenced policy so deeply that they have externalized a huge portion of their operating expenses, meaning they're not held accountable for vast swaths of their operations. These hidden costs, as we refer to them, are wide-ranging, Some of them can be more direct impacts, including things like skyrocketing road maintenance from increased tractor trailer traffic, or drinking and recreational water contamination. But they can also be more subtle or indirect in the form of large scale shifts in worker wages and safety standards, or a lack of access to nutritious food stemming from policies corporations have influenced. The problem is that eventually someone has to pay up, and the burden of these costs fall disproportionately onto socially disadvantaged communities. Areas with high densities of industrialized animal production are more likely to be in BIPOC communities, leaving them disproportionately exposed to poor air and water quality, odors, decreased property values, corresponding health issues, and general rural wealth extraction that's associated with these models. BIPOC communities are also more likely to live in food deserts or have limited access to fresh nutritional foods. This lack of access to nutritional foods stems directly from farm policy that subsidizes the production of highly processed sugars and fats while failing to support or incentivize the production of healthy foods. So we need a farm and food system that will support and empower our communities, not one that just prioritizes corporate profits above all else. So, how did we get here is a question I get a lot. Well, industrial agriculture interests have spent billions of dollars on myth-based marketing campaigns and lobbyists who have worked hard to convince politicians and the American public that we need these models of industrial agriculture, that it is safe, that it is efficient, that it is the only way to affordably feed our country. Who hasn't heard implications along the lines of America feeds the world, or Roundup is perfectly safe when people use it correctly? But there's all these myths, and there really are. They're nothing more than myths that industrial agriculture perpetuates to affect policies that continue to give them an unfair advantage in the playing field, consequently further limiting both consumer access to food raised under alternative production models and pushing out those remaining farmers who are using alternative production models out of the market. So let me give you a couple concrete examples of what I'm discussing here. I don't have time to go into all of the various myths we've identified at Farm Action, but if you're interested, we have a whole Mythbuster blog series on our website that can go through them in details. So for now, let's just consider this concept of affordability. Are these production models that work at maximizing scale and efficiency really keeping food affordable? Well, if we've seen anything at all in the last couple of years, we have seen how this isn't working. The cost of food has skyrocketed at rates that far outpace inflation. And where we have seen it rise the fastest is in the most highly consolidated industries like meat and eggs and dairy and snack foods. Corporate consolidation has left our food and farm system at unhealthy levels of concentration, where just a handful of corporations control huge percentages of the markets. And with only a few players controlling each market, corporations can easily take advantage of public perceptions and orchestrate coordinated, unjustified price hikes under the guise of supply chain issues or rising costs, or in recently with the egg debacle, avian flu. The truth is that industrial agriculture is not keeping food affordable, and instead it has given corporations control over what consumers will pay. And nothing against corporations, but they are by definition designed to maximize profits, not to keep food affordable. Well, we're here today to talk about the true cost of food. So, there's another important unaccounted expense. As a result of lobbying efforts on behalf of meatpacking corporations, right now, only roughly 4% of farm subsidies go toward the production of fruits and vegetables, while over 30% go to support animal feed and industrial livestock operations. The result of this upside-down farm subsidy program is that the United States is now in a diet-related health crisis. More than 9% of the US has type 2 diabetes, and nearly 42% of US inhabitants are classified as obese. Improved and equitable access to nutritious foods would directly address food and nutrition insecurity. However, current policies create barriers to their production, instead and instead drive farmers to overproduce animal feed and grains and highly processed sugars and fats. So not only has industrial agriculture handed over control of the price of food to corporations, but it has also influenced policy so that foods that our own dietary guidelines recommend we fill half our plate with are underproduced, imported, expensive, and hard to access, while junk food is relatively affordable and available at every corner store. So what can we do? The Farm Bill is just around the corner, and we see this as a huge opportunity to start to introduce changes in policies that create the structure of our food and farm system. Farm Action has envisioned a fair farm bill that has laid out the groundwork for a farm and food system, one that prioritizes the needs of farmers, of workers, of consumers, and of our communities above corporate interests. This means policies that will empower our farmers to grow nutritious, regeneratively produced foods for their communities, making local and environmentally sustainable food production models the norm instead of the exception, and in all of this centering equity. And so this is our vision of what a fair farm bill should look like. If you want more details about that, we have a lot of great resources and information on our Farm Bill campaign's website. And I'm really looking forward to, I think some of the other panelists are going to be talking about policy recommendations that would really lift up this vision. So these are the kinds of changes that will begin to hold industrial agriculture responsible for its true cost of operations. And in doing so, we'll be able to start to chip away at the corporate control of our food system, putting the power back into the hands of our community members.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you contextualizing the true costs of industrial agriculture and highlighting that this year that there is an opportunity to begin breaking apart corporation consolidation and instead bringing back these much needed resources back to communities that, to help them find affordable food and that is nutritious, but it's also good for our farmers and our environment. And with that, I would like to now bring Amy into the discussion. Amy, you have hands-on experience working alongside women campesinas. Could you tell us a bit about the impacts of our current food system on farm workers, especially female farm workers?
Yes, thank you, Evelyn, for the space to share some of our input and priorities here today. Farm worker women, or as we call them, campesinas, are some of the most vulnerable and most impacted by our farm and food system. They're often exposed to health and safety risks every single day, whether it's from heat exposure or heavy rain, cold, smoke from wildfires, or even just violence in the workplace. We saw a lot of these things being exacerbated during the COVID-19 2020 and currently still, but we have a lot of concerns over how heavily reliant the agricultural industry is on using chemicals and pesticides without doing any sort of risk assessment on the impacts that it has on the workers being exposed to them on the day-to-day. A lot of the issues that we're hearing from our campesina members is that they're developing fertility issues, they're having skin rashes, skin diseases, respiratory issues, hair loss, dietary impact from being exposed to heavy chemicals, and they're often never told what the chemicals are that they're using. They're not trained on how to use them. They're not even told what the name of the product is. Sometimes they're put into a bin without a label, or if something does have a label, it's only in English. And so there's this huge gap of workers not being informed on how to be safe, not being informed on how to safely use these chemicals. So there's not just an issue with using chemicals that are super harsh, but also a very common problem with misusing the chemicals. We see this affecting farm worker women, especially as we're seeing a lot of endocrine effects, meaning a lot of women are experiencing issues themselves, but when they give birth to their children are often born with neurological differences, or sometimes their children are born with health conditions that are long time or permanent due to the exposure that they had while they were working. And this is not just an outdoor field, this is sometimes in nurseries as well. And so we see this impact differently depending on where in the country people are, but overall, this is a serious concern. We also see a lot of violence and discrimination based on the fact that farm worker women are not male. And so just to go over that, we see a lot of disproportionate recruitment and hiring among women. Sometimes they're not considered for the job, as we see only about 30 to 34% of the farm worker workforce being male. And the discrimination is so much more severe in the H-2A program, which is the Agricultural Temporary Work Program. About 6% of H-2A workers are women. So the recruitment in that program is severely biased against women, and we see even more discrimination in the workplace. Sometimes women are not considered for, the more desirable shifts or work. They're harassed or sometimes assaulted in the workplace. They experience a lot more wage theft. A lot of women still say that their wages are not even paid to them, but paid to their husbands or their male family members. And so they have very little control over the type of environment they're working in, and even less control because they don't even have access to their wages, which creates a lot of insecurity for women who are responsible for taking care of their children or trying to be independent if they need to leave a violent home because of domestic violence. We also see the impact of food insecurity pretty heavily in rural communities and for farm worker families, whether they are farm workers or not, but live in an area where there is a lot of farm worker families. These are often communities that are pretty isolated. And so that means there's a lot of food deserts, or there's not a lot of access to healthy and fresh foods, despite the fact that they may work in an industry where they are cultivating foods to feed the entire country. This is even more prevalent for the migrant workforce, who often arrive to the US and are not even sure the name of the employer, where they are working, the name of the town, what close grocery stores they have, because they might not have internet or phone signal where they're living, and they're completely dependent on their employer to bring them into town to buy groceries or to provide cooked meals for them. And so that leaves even less options for that group of workers. There's also a high cost of food based to the comparison to the wages that we see. Migrant and farm workers are excluded, agricultural workers are excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so we see a lot of extremely low wages or not fair compensation to be able to keep up with the rising cost of food. So that's an overview of how the impacts of the food system have with farm worker women. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll wait till later in your presentation to share some of those. Thank you.
No, thank you, Amy. Your insights really put into perspective the social and health costs of the industrial agriculture model on farm workers, especially Latino farm workers. And I think this is an issue that often gets swept under the rug and it's kind of hidden from our view. But thank you for those insights. And Eloisa, you have a unique perspective on food insecurity as a leader working to help communities access healthy and affordable food. Can you tell us what barriers does the Latinx community face in achieving food security, and how can sustainable food production increase food security?
Thank you, Evelyn. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to be here and already learning so much for my amazing co-panelists. So thank you for the invite to speak today. I'd like to start by saying that food security is a complex issue that's influenced by various factors. And although it is a complex issue, many political decisions lead to hunger and nutrition insecurity, and in the US and around the world. And I'm a firm believer that we can eradicate hunger and nutrition insecurity in this country and globally. So on a larger global scale, and some of these things were mentioned before, we're talking about climate change, poverty, conflict, and instability, lack of infrastructure, biosecurity threats, and trade policies. But within the community itself, the Latina community, we're talking about very specific issues. Language barriers were mentioned before. So that's one that we see very often. And when we talk about language barriers, we have to really look beyond Spanish and English. A lot of the folks that immigrate here that are working on the farms may only speak their indigenous language. And so that presents an even bigger challenge for them to access resources that may be available to them. Immigration status is another one as well. If you are afraid that you're going to be deported or you're going to be mistreated, you are not going to even access the things that are being given to you or being made accessible by community-based organizations, right? That may not come directly from government aid. And so when we look at all of these different things, one thing that we really need to remember within the Latina community is that we are not a monolith. We are a diverse group of people that come from various backgrounds and various cultures. So cultural relevancy is another important factor. We may have a lot of similarities within our food, but there is differences as well, and that can limit food choices for people. If you're not familiar with a specific food, you're less likely to eat it. And within our own communities, we're talking about people who may experience even more challenges beyond language and beyond immigration status. And we're talking about disabled folks as well, or folks with different gender identities that may be further marginalized within the communities and at large as well. And so all of these things really affect nutrition and food security for many different reasons. And subsidies were mentioned before. Subsidies can be a great way to support domestic agriculture. However, when not thought of in an intentional way to benefit everyone within this food system, what we have is a corporate control system that continues to benefit the very few and the very wealthy, continues to displace small farmers, and continues this history of colonization that has led to the food apartheid and food insecurity that we see within our communities and within many different groups that are racialized here, right, in the US and elsewhere. And just to give you some perspective of what it looks like for the Latina community, about 16.2% of Hispanic households experienced food insecurity in 2019. And the national average is 10.5%. So about 1 in 4 Hispanic children are experiencing food insecurity right now as we're talking, right? They don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And farm workers are hungry. So the same people that are growing our food, packing our food, are not able to afford the food that they're growing. Even in New York, we see the food delivery folks not being able to afford the food that they're delivering. Just not that long ago, I was in conversation with a father who stopped by one of our distribution hubs in order to get food. And it just broke my heart. I mean, I guess I'm emotional thinking about it, but he was picking up food because he couldn't even afford the food that he was delivering. So that's exactly where we are today. So, to me, we're not going to get anywhere if we don't address the disruption of our food system, the anti-indigeneity, the anti-Blackness, the racialization that leads also to less economic opportunities for these folks, right? So the language barriers, the immigration status, and even if you are in the US and you have legal status here, you may face all of these other issues as well, right? So as I said earlier, all of these complexities within our communities for different folks who are facing multiple challenges at the same time need to be addressed within policy. Dietary restrictions is another one. You may have dietary restrictions for medical reasons, for philosophical reasons. And so we need to address those issues as well. And I think that, the way forward is really to support a local and regional food systems that support local communities, that lead to food sovereignty, not just to food and nutrition security, because I do think that that's a very temporary resolve to a longstanding problem that needs to be addressed in a very holistic way, in a very holistic manner. And we need to use this opportunity of the Farm Bill, right? Every 5 years, at least for those of us who are working on the ground, we build alternate systems of survival. We, educate our communities. We come together. We feed our folks. But yet, every 5 years, Congress decides that they're going to undo all of the work that we're doing. We can't do this alone. We need the policy changes on that level, on that systemic level, to support Black farmers, Latina farmers, Indigenous farmers, so that way we can create the food sovereignty that we hope to see. And so we see nutrition security. And we need to shift the subsidies to food that is healthy, vegetables, grains for human consumption, fruits as well. And so, that's what I hope to see. And I think that as far as agriculture, we have to move towards sustainable agriculture for various reasons, right? Sustainable agriculture can lead to conserving natural resources, and agricultural practices with crop rotation and intercropping and agroforestry help to conserve those natural resources such as soil, water, and biodiversity. Right now, what we're seeing is a destruction of those natural resources because these subsidies are incentivizing environmental degradation. It leads to improved food quality. When we use and reduce the amount of synthetic chemicals, we promote the use of natural fertilizers, right? And not only is that good for the food, but it's good for the workers. We cannot talk about food security if we don't talk about farm workers being completely poisoned by these chemical fertilizers that are being used to grow our food. And so that's something that we need to think about, is how do we involve everyone? So the animals that are experiencing tremendous suffering, the farm workers that are experiencing tremendous suffering within this farm bill that only currently benefits these multinational corporations, that benefit those who historically have held power, who have disrupted our food system, who have disrupted indigenous ways of growing food, that lead those, when we have the knowledge of indigenous food waste, right? Whether your background is Latina, indigenous, or you're Black, you're more likely to be healthy. You're more likely to make healthy choices. And so improving food quality and supporting local community. I think one of the things, that I mentioned earlier was poverty. Poverty and food insecurity are political decisions in many ways. And so when we support local sustainable agriculture, we're promoting the use of local resources, we're creating employment opportunities, and we're ensuring that communities have access to fresh, nutritious, and affordable food right there and immediately. What we saw during the pandemic, at the height of that pandemic, was a complete disruption of the food system because the power is concentrated in very few corporations, and that impacted all of our communities, right? And that impacted access to healthy foods. And so I hope to see within this farm bill just changes because what the farm bill is currently doing, it has currently done, is really destroy the efforts that we have on the ground, the policy recommendations that we're making, all the time. How many more policy recommendations can we make? How many more submissions to the Federal Register? And so, I really ask everyone who's watching to really support the Food and Farm Act that was just introduced by Representative Blumenauer. It's really a comprehensive bill that takes into consideration everyone who's part of the food system, whether they're working on the fields, whether they're animals that are in these factory farms, or whether there are somebody who has to depend on SNAP and receiving that type of assistance. We can no longer afford to do this. We have to support local and regional food systems. We have to support sustainable agriculture, and we have to get to the root cause of what has led here. We have to really address the elephant in the room, which is the history of racism, the history of colonialism, and how now that is really shown in our system. The introduction of cash crops came from colonialism. The introduction of animals that had never existed here came from colonialism, leading to a system that exists purely for profit and not for sustenance.
Thank you. And I think what you described really encapsulates what happens when we don't approach food systems with an equity lens. And thank you for highlighting this need for change, which segues into my next question. Vanessa, now that we know some of the barriers and challenges associated with our current food system model, how can we bridge policymakers and communities to build a resilient food system?
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn, for the question, and to my previous panelists for giving us so much grounding information about how do we move forward. And obviously, we have been talking a lot about the Farm Bill, and obviously the Farm Bill, it is our best available tool right now because it's a bill that has been around for over almost 100 years. So I would like us first to start, we need to answer the questions as eaters, as consumers. How has the Farm Bill impacted me today? And I want you to ask that question of yourself right now and be like, do you receive a SNAP at some point of your life? Do you buy food at the farmer's market? What foods do you buy when you go to the supermarket over others? What foods are actually feeding you and your community? And who is feeding you and your community? How many farms are in my community? Do we have nonprofit organizations in my community that are supporting beginning farmer ranchers? They are supporting farmers of color. Is there an extension or nonprofit doing education on sustainable agriculture in my community? Do I have a land-grant university in my community that is training people to be more connected to better natural resource management? These are all questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And when we answer those questions about how has the Farm Bill impacted me, we need to be telling our stories. The more we tell our stories about the food systems that we want and how the food system decisions that we have made previously in previous Farm Bills, we have more tools, more advocacy tools to change the narratives in the food systems now. Again, the more we tell those stories, we can connect them to policies that have been made prior to us. Obviously, we cannot undo everything that the Farm Bill is and has done in 1 year, or in one Farm Bill, in one cycle. But every year we get a little better. Not every year, every time we have a Farm Bill, every Farm Bill cycle. For example, in the 2012-2014 Farm Bill, we got a strong package of local and regional food systems programming that gave us a lot of more support to local food markets, farmers markets, and a lot of what we usually consider regulatory programs. So that way we were able to push more federal funding to change the way agriculture looks in our communities. We were able to see a spike in farmers markets, and we were able to see more growth in areas that make the food system stronger and more sustainable and more resilient. But again, that took many years of advocacy from groups and individuals telling their food system stories. For example, in the 2018 Farm Bill, we got the Office of Urban Agriculture set in the Department of Agriculture, which is a huge win when for so long we never saw urban agriculture as a meaningful or like the right way of farming in this country. And now that's embedded into legislature as part of the Farm Bill. And now we have an office in the Department of Agriculture supporting urban agriculture. So every Farm Bill is an opportunity to reshape our food system. And obviously, we need to be telling our stories, our values, our priorities as eaters, as consumers, as nonprofits related to food and agriculture to shape the food systems that we want. And there's also 2 easy ways that you can do that. You can tell your story to your elected member of Congress. Every member of Congress is going to vote in the Farm Bill at some point this year. It's not only the Agricultural Committee, it's not only the Appropriations and Budget, everyone is going to get to vote on it. So you want to make sure that you are telling your story and telling your priorities and how the Farm Bill has impacted you to your member of Congress. And obviously you can do that by when they're in town, when they're visiting UN districts, like right now, Congress is on recess. So most of them are back home visiting farms, visiting farmers markets, and connecting with their community members. So this is a great timing for you to find them and tell them, hey, I really value SNAP. Please fight for a SNAP on the Farm Bill. Or I'm a young farmer and I really need land access. Please make sure there's a land access program in the Farm Bill, which is one of the priorities that young farmers has. Example, and if you don't find them in DC, or if you have been telling your story for a long time, you can come to DC to tell your story. Example, last month, National Young Farmers Coalition, we brought 135 farmers, all young farmers, mostly BIPOC farmers from across the country, to meet with their members of Congress and tell them their land access struggles and the Farm Bill priorities, mostly around conservation, fighting climate change, and feeding our communities. So when we're talking about how do we bridge the gap, we need to bridge the gap by telling our stories to those elected officials who are shaping our policies and all the other interventions related to food and farm systems. But we need to be saying that all the time, consistently, and not just by ourselves. As individuals, we have a lot of power. We get to vote. We get to do advocacy. Some of us get to do lobbying. But we need to join bigger organizations and organizations that align with our values and with the food systems that we want. So we can have bigger coalitions that can ask those bigger asks, and we all united can get more deliverables out of the policies that serve us. Only when we're all more together and asking for the same things through different coalitions and different advocacy spaces, we become a sounding board. Like, this is something that cannot be ignored. This is something that we need to do now. And obviously, we have learned that from previous Farm Bills when we all came together and we were asking for the same things, we got them more easily. So again, this is an opportunity for all of us as eaters and consumers and nonprofit related to food and agriculture advocacy to come together as part of these coalitions and get involved in the Farm Bill in different ways available to us. And this is really important that when we're thinking about food systems resilience, we're thinking about diversity. Diversity is one of the values of food systems resilience. Obviously, we had talked a lot about power and consolidation across the food system. The more people with different food stories getting involved in telling their food system stories, we get to shape the food system to all the different values and all the diversity of experiences that are in our community. As Eloisa was saying, we are not monolithic. Even in the food and agriculture advocacy groups, we are all completely different. We all have different priorities. We talk to each other, we like each other, but we need to be advocating for our priorities with diversity in mind. The more diversity we have across the food system, from food system access, who is farming, to where we buy our food, to who is farming and how we are farming, all of those options build more food system resilience. So when a shock comes to the citizen, something like a pandemic, a conflict, or a trade dispute, we all better prepare and we can keep our communities fed. For example, National Union Farmers Coalition, most of our farmers are farming not for business, not to make a profit, but to keep our communities fed and to fight climate change. So we need to be reminding ourselves, why are we advocating? We are advocating for a more resilient food system. And the only way we do that is, again, by telling our story so we can all continue to be fed and continue fighting climate change with more tools we hope will become available on this Farm Bill. Again, every Farm Bill is an opportunity to reshape the food and farming system to the values that we want to. And obviously, the more we tell our stories, the more the Farm Bill looks to have our values. An example of that, it was last year, 180 organizations came together with a food system transformation value agenda. Like, we do not care about what is in the Farm Bill, but these are the values that we would like to see in the Farm Bill. And remember, when we're talking about people that may disagree with us about what policies should go in the Farm Bill, we always need to remember that we may have the same values, we just disagree on how to get there. So always telling your story from a place of values, of hard work, of community, are really important for us to move forward as we do our Farm Bill advocacy. And that is my opinion, the best way we bridge the gap between policymakers and build a more resilient food system.
Thank you, Vanessa, for those great points and highlighting the power of storytelling to really use it as a tool for change. And thank you to the rest of our panelists for engaging in this discussion. At this point in the program, we're going to begin the Q&A session. I will start off by asking a few questions and then opening it up to the audience. And if you haven't had a chance yet to please ask any questions in our Q&A chat. And this question is for any of our panelists. And the question is, what role does geography have in addressing food system transformation?
Should we just jump in, Evelyn? Or?
Yes, please.
So I think we've all touched on this a little bit, but it's just, as far as geography is concerned, we need a farm and food system where it doesn't matter where you live or who you are, that you have access to healthy, nutritious foods. And this really plays into the importance of building up our local and regional food systems by empowering farmers through our farm policies to be able to grow nutritious, healthy foods for their communities. These systems are really the exception right now instead of the norm. And until we can do that, we are going to see what we have today, where we have a lot of inequity up and down the food across our country over who is able to eat what.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I mean, I think we have to think of how geography affects the food system, and then take that and say how are we going to address those issues. So the climate of a region determines the type of crops that can be grown and the availability of water resources. So if you're living next to a factory farm and your soil is being polluted and your air is being polluted, that's going to have tremendous impact on whether or not you're able to grow food. It also has an impact on the food that is consumed because of the food that is being produced there. Land use for agriculture as well and urban development can have a significant impact. So if you're in an urban area where there is more development, your access to growing food may only come from community gardens or indoor farming as well, and transportation. So if the further you get from farm to plate has an impact on the food that you eat as well. And so it's extremely important to really look at the region of where we are to develop those policies, because the policies that work in one area are not going to work in another. The same thing happens when we talk about, nutrition education. We can tell people to eat healthy and all we want, but if we're not looking at that environment that they're living in, we're doing them a disservice, right? And so that's something that definitely affects food systems, how we can impact food systems, and which has a long history of, when we're talking about the land back movement and taking back land and food sovereignty, we really need to look at the regions where that's happening even more. There's a map of where there were plantations here in the U.S. There's a really great film called The Smell of Money, and when they overlapped that map of where these places were, that's exactly where all these factory farms are located, right? So we're talking about geography. How in your face is that right there where this history of marginalization has existed is exactly where these factory farms are coming to. And we talk about farm workers that even whether they're outside or inside in the nursery, they're experiencing this further marginalization. So we're talking about geography, not just where we grow food, but where we're consuming food and how far the food is coming from us. We're very detached from, most of us are very detached from the geography where food is grown, right? We have a farm worker that may be growing food in California and we're receiving that food in New York. So we have to think about those interconnections there in order to create policies that benefit everyone.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
I could add something. Yeah, I think just kind of adding on a little bit to what my co-panelists were saying is that for us, for campesinas, we see that there's such a huge lack for federal protections, whether it's worker protections, health and safety, or discrimination protections. But even in the states that do have more protections, like in the state of California, which is our biggest agricultural state, we have so many issues that prevent the protections from really actually benefiting such a huge farm worker population. And part of the reason is because of the lack of migrant and immigrant justice. About 75% of the farm worker population in the state of California is undocumented or underdocumented. And so that plays a huge role in how they engage with these agencies. They're scared to report, a safety violation on the farm operation that they're working on. They're afraid to ask questions of like what products are being used in my workplace. They're afraid to, get help. They're afraid to get health benefits for their children because they don't want to put their name in a system. There's no trust with a lot of agencies or even larger organizations. And so geographically, sometimes it's hard for us to say, well, your state has all these great protections in comparison to this other state that has none, when the realities of the day-to-day issues is that their lack of immigrant status really even prevents them from being protected by those. So we really advocate for, more federal and national protections when it comes to heat stress and other health and safety measures. And that's just my opinion there.
Vanessa, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would like to add two things. I think we need to look obviously at our geographical areas when we're thinking about geography. We have seen a lot of momentum build when a lot of regional coalitions come together to put forward policy priorities that are region specific. And that's something that we definitely should be moving forward, because it's true, the way the food system works in New England is different than it works in the Midwest and vice versa. So we definitely should continue on building the geographical camaraderie so we can have more support and a specific, more diversity on how food system programming looks across the country. But also we need to be looking at personal geography. How does your food system geography look like for you as an eater? Like, where are you buying food? Where are you procuring food? And what entry points of local food do you have available to you? And that will tell you a lot of answers about the food system, that way it's being shaped around you. So I would also like to push you to think about your personal food geography.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. These are all really great points. And I think actually lead us right into a question from the audience from Maricel, and she says, I think a lot of times these food issues are depicted as only being rural issues. Can you further explain how food insecurity and food deserts impact urban communities?
I'll jump in. I do think that the person who asked this question is completely right. I think it's always, oh, those other people there, not in the United States. And, during the pandemic, we saw 51 million people depending on food banks. And this is happening here. And consistently, we have over 30 million Americans who are food insecure, right? And that's, I think, a low number. That's an estimate. I think we're being very generous with those numbers. And so it definitely affects Americans. And in urban areas, in New York, actually, we have the highest rate of food insecurity among students, the highest rate of housing insecurity among students. We have the largest school district in the country. And as you know, New York's a large city. And yeah, that's exactly what's happening here. And so it impacts us very much so. And this is across the board in cities. So food insecurity doesn't just impact rural areas, it impacts urban areas as well. And just to go back to those subsidies, which affect affordability, going back to racialization, going back to that concentration of power. And as Vanessa was saying before, that is why it's so important for us to tell the story and use the power of the narrative and build those coalitions. And I just like to say that, everyone has a voice. So we're not just talking about the adults talking, but at Chili's on Wheels, we work with a lot of youth. And one of the things that we do is make sure that they have the support system and the resources to talk about the changes that they want to see in the Farm Bill, because food insecurity affects children. It affects youth more than anyone else. And so we really have to think about how we address food insecurity at those intersections of, age, right? Elders who may not have support, children, disabled folks, trans folks, and realize that we all have a story to tell, that we're all caught up within this food system, and that this is not a somebody else has this problem issue. This is really an American issue. It's a political decision. I believe, as I said earlier, that we can end this food apartheid and that we can end this food insecurity and hunger that people are experiencing here. But there are many folks who are going to vote against that because they're going to vote in the interest of large corporations.
Thank you. Yeah, these are all really great points. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I mean, just to back up Eloisa, that, I think a lot of us who work on the Farm Bill really try to get across that this is, if you eat, this bill affects you regardless of where you're living. This structures what is available, how it costs, if it's reliable, how it's produced. So, everybody living everywhere should care about the Farm Bill.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's an all of us issue, and we need to approach it that way. And with that, I wanted to jump into another audience question, and that is, what are some examples that could act as a role model for transforming food systems?
I can go on this one. So we need to go back to all the things that happened during the pandemic. The pandemic gave us a lot of liberty and flexibility to reshape the food system to actually feed people and focus on helping people in a way that it was a necessary investment given the times that we were living on. So we saw a lot of funding. We saw a lot of funding go to people that were in need during that time, from farmers to eaters. So we need to take some of the lessons that we learned during the pandemic, especially in the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan, and apply that to the Farm Bill now. And that's the challenge ahead for us. For example, a pilot program was started during the Farm Bill, during the coronavirus times, that focuses on increasing land access for young farmers. Because right now we do not have any land access program in the Farm Bill. We have a lot of education and training in the Farm Bill programs, but nothing related about actually putting farmers on the land. So we saw that program happen, and $300 million were allocated to do a pilot program. And that's the kind of flexibility that we were giving in the previous years, because we had this extra funding to feed our communities and focus on putting people in the land. So a program like that, we would love to see actually authorized and funded in the Farm Bill, because it will allow us to continue putting farmers on the land and keeping our communities fed because as you know, during the pandemic especially, people who had never gone to a farmer's market went to the farmer's market. People who had never signed up for a CSA signed up for a CSA. A lot of our farmers literally paved their roads to their farms so people can come and drive to their farms, because at a time like that, we needed to keep people fed, and farmers that were local and were growing vegetables and were diversified were the ones that were able to do that. So we want to see programs like the Land Access Marketing and Capital Program authorized and funded in the Farm Bill.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great example of how this very difficult situation actually brought upon these creative solutions. And now that we know these, like, we have to harness actually bringing them into this next Farm Bill. Amy, would you like to add anything?
You said Amy, right? Yeah, so I think this is an example of how campesinas that are Alianza members are trying to take control over their access to healthy foods and to their ability to practice their ancestral farming practices is through a project called Madre Tierra. It's something that's a project in 3 different places in Florida, 3 different counties in Florida. And a lot of campesina women are learning how to create their own compost, how to take care of their own soil, how to grow their own fruits and vegetables in kind of community gardens. We call them huertas. And communities are able to now have access to fruits and vegetables that are from their home country. They're able to pass these skills on to their children. And, you know, these campesinas are now considering themselves small farmers and beginner farmers. And it'd be great if, like, you know, encouraging and uplifting what Vanessa said, if there were more land access programs that would not have like immigration status as a barrier, or did not have high experience requirements to be able to access not just the information and the resources in a language that they understand, but to actually be able to apply for loans so that they can access land and be able to grow more of these fruits and vegetables and that are cultural foods. And, you know, we're also at Alianza really supportive of ideas of, you know, community-based organizations or farm worker cooperatives, creating land access opportunities for farm workers who are not able to access the financial resources for that themselves. But those are some examples in some ways that campesinas are creating change in the food system.
That's great. Sarah, Eloisa, would you all like to add anything on?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And, you know, I wanted to second Vanessa and Amy's points. So the pandemic taught us so much, but I think one of the takeaways that we really need to just internalize is that we cannot continue operating from an emergency, urgency food system, right? That we need to change the system at the root. And, you know, ideally what I would like to see is that we don't need food banks anymore, that we don't need SNAP anymore. And so we need to incentivize work and economic opportunities. As Amy was saying, there are so many people that are so willing, that want to work, that want to contribute, but there are so many obstacles because of immigration status, because they don't have a 501c3. And so in New York, we have the largest mutual aid network in the country. The amount of food that is being mobilized from farm to table by these, amazing mutual aid networks are millions and millions of pounds of food, yet they cannot receive the support on any level because they may not have the immigration status, or they don't have the 501c3 status, right? So this is what I mean when we talk about food sovereignty versus food security, right? If we are talking about food sovereignty, that we let people within their communities really shape what agriculture means to them, how they interact with their own food system, and we let them have that power. There are so many different movements that I think are really just amazing. The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Movement, which is a growing movement of Indigenous communities from around the world that are really reclaiming traditional food systems and advocating for their rights to manage and protect their lands and resources. We see the Slow Food Movement as well, which is an international organization. And they're promoting local, sustainable, and traditional food production and consumption practices. So there's always those themes of traditional foods, cultural relevancy, indigenous practices. And I just like to say that indigenous people exist all over the world. They don't just exist here. So, it doesn't mean that you're of a specific race. I think a lot of times we think of traditional indigenous ways as, being just of one specific racial background. So those movements, I think, are very inspiring. There's also the plant-based movement that's really looking to increase consumption of plant-based foods that are whole, that are organic, in order to really protest this factory farming system that we have now, where over 99% of our food comes from. I mean, this is what we're looking at, 99% of our food being produced in factory farms, animals suffering, fertilizers, toxic chemicals. And so we're really reclaiming our knowledge, the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that has been interrupted, as Amy was saying, and really taking back that power and shaping what we want to see, the healthy communities that we want to see in our own way. So, we're going to keep pushing until those obstacles are gone, until our folks have the resources, regardless of immigration status, regardless of gender identity, regardless of disability.
Thank you. Sarah, is there anything that you would like to add?
Everybody made really great points. There's, I can be brief. There's one other really great program, the Gus Shoemaker Nutrition Incentive Program, that was, I think a lot of us are advocating to scale up. It's a new program that is connecting nutrition access needs through produce prescription programs and other grant opportunities. This is another pandemic era program that was, successful, and we can scale it to a non-emergency type of operation to really help lift up access to fresh fruits and vegetables in our communities. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
These are all really great examples. Thank you. And I think we might just have time for one more question. And we have a question from the audience from Daniel. And this question is actually for you, Vanessa. And he asked, large agricultural corporations have handcuffed small family farms throughout the U.S. by leveraging patent rights and unfair lease contracts. In what way can the Farm Bill help address this issue?
So one of the things that we are asking on the Farm Bill is more funding for something called a total survey that focuses on research and for land access and tenure. Right now, we do not have more transparency, and there are other mechanisms and other laws out there that prevent us from having better mechanisms for transparency on who owns farmland in the United States. We do believe that having more information will lead to more regulatory action to prevent farmland consolidation. Because that's what we're seeing. And also, we do not have the best tools and regulatory tools to enforce land leases, land prices, or many other things related to land access in this country. So right now, we're only asking for more research so we can maybe have more tools to inform policy in a future Farm Bill. But this is something that is really dependent to Congress funding the study, because right now the study is authorized, it's certainly underfunded. In our last survey, I think it was 2016. So, for example, in 2021, we heard a lot about Bill Gates being the number one farmland owner. We should have known that 4 years in advance. We should have to wait 5 years. So things like that allow us to have more tools to create better regulatory tools. But we need information first.
Thank you. And with that concludes our Q&A session. So really thank you everyone for providing such thought-provoking questions, and thank you to our panelists for engaging in a fruitful conversation. And we are now reaching the end of this briefing. So I wanted to give you all the opportunity to share your final thoughts. So if there's just one thing that our audience should take away from today's panel, what would that be? And we can start with you, Vanessa.
Sure. The most important thing, the next generation of farmers is ready to feed our communities and fight climate change, but they need land access and more tools to be able to start farming and stay farming.
Thank you. Eloisa, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that this has been said a few times, but we're all part of the food system, but we're not going to heal if we don't do it collectively. So we need to heal in communion, come together, and, fight the big fight, because we're fighting, the same enemy. And these are multinational corporations that have the control over our food system. And Chile Somios is going to, keep up that fight and feeding our communities and building the alternate systems of survival while we work towards systemic change.
Thank you. And Amy, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So I'd like to say that, farm worker women's realities are often invisible to policymakers, and Alianza's advocacy and grassroots organizing is really focused on increasing the visibility of the exploitation and abuse that takes place every single day where our food is being grown, processed, and packed. We need a farm bill and related legislation that's going to include farm worker concerns and solutions, such as eliminating immigration status as a barrier to nutritional assistance programs or to USDA loan programs. We need to advocate for the direction of USDA funding and the rural development to actually benefit farm workers with better housing, to address the poisoned water systems that currently are poisoned with mercury and sometimes even lithium. And we really need research to be done in collaboration with community-based organizations that have trusted relationships and reputations in our farm worker communities. Overall, farm workers cannot continue to be overlooked in the Farm Bill. And right now, there are an estimated 2.4 to 2.5 million farm workers across the country who are extremely well positioned to be our country's next generation of farm operators. And so we think that they need to be not just considered, but centered in a lot of this advocacy. Thank you.
Yeah. And Sarah, would you like to close off the closing remarks for the panelists?
Sure. So we need a farm bill that is going to put the control of our food and farm system back into the hands of farmers and consumers and workers. We heard from all of my co-panelists about how our food and farming system is failing. We heard from Amy about how it's failing farm workers, from Eloisa, it's failing our communities, and from Vanessa, how it's failing our farmers. It's also, we've talked about how it's failing our environment and our health. And another interesting fact is it's even failing on an economic argument. We see ourselves as an agricultural powerhouse, but we're now actually recording a trade deficit because we are importing more food than we export. It's failing everyone but corporations who will continue to reap record profits without change. So it is time that we face the truth. We don't need industrial agriculture. We need a fair farm bill.
Thank you. No, these are all great points, and I feel really inspired about all your work, and I'm really excited to see the work that y'all continue to do. As we've heard from today's panelists, the current food system as it exists is ill-equipped to support the needs of a growing population sustainably. Politicians and industrial farmers have kept the status quo, claiming that the only pathway to achieve low-cost food is by producing at a grander scale. However, the current model, heralded by technological advancements, dietary changes, and globalization, has led to environmental degradation, increased price volatility, and increased barriers for marginalized communities to access affordable and healthy foods. Ultimately, cheap foods does not internalize the environmental and social costs of the industrial agriculture model. And as we end this discussion, I'd like to urge all of you to follow along with this year's Farm Bill proceedings and urge your representatives to prioritize conservation programs and social equity for marginalized farmers. I'd also urge you all to shop locally to the extent that you can, and take a moment to truly appreciate where our food comes from and how it is grown. As I said in the beginning, food connects people and cultures across time and space. It's important we understand how our food gets to our table and the implications of it. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all so much for your time and attention.